Hello and welcome back to Classic Times. Today we'll be going through stage 37 of the Cambridge Latin course, and I'll be covering the topics of the indirect statements with perfect actives and perfect passives. Okay, let's begin. Perfect active indirect statements. So this is formed with a main verb plus an accusative plus an infinitive, but more specifically a perfect active infinitive. And if we have a look at this example in English, we hear Agricola to have conquered Britain, but more naturally we would translate it as we hear that Agricola has conquered Britain. And you can see there's a main verb, we hear, an accusative, Agricola, and a perfect active infinitive. And the perfect active infinitive is translated to mean to have something, and it is formed with a perfect stem plus the letters isse. For example, portar wisse means to have carried. So now, let's compare the perfect active indicative forms with the perfect active infinitive. So on the left hand side, you have your regular perfect active indicative forms. For example, docui, meaning I have taught or I taught. And on the right hand side, you have the perfect active infinitive forms, for instance, docuisi, meaning to have taught. And notice that the perfect active infinitive endings have the letters I double se onto the end of the perfect stem. So now that we've met the perfect active indirect statement, let's move on and have a look at the perfect passive form. So similarly to the perfect active, perfect passive indirect statements are formed with a main verb plus an accusative plus an infinitive, but this time that infinitive is perfect passive in form as opposed to perfect active. And if we have a look at an example in English, Caecilius thinks that Clemens has been sent to the forum. Thinks is your main verb, Clemens is in the accusative, and has been sent is your perfect passive infinitive. And a perfect passive infinitive, meaning to have been something, is formed with a perfect passive participle plus esse. For example, portatus esse. This means to have been caught. And finally, before we move on to the vocab, I would like you to compare the indicative and the infinitive forms of the perfect passive. So on the left hand side, you have your ordinary perfect passive indicative forms. For example, tractus sum, meaning I have been dragged. And on the right hand side, you have your perfect passive infinitive forms. For example, tractus esse, meaning to have been dragged. And you should be able to notice that the only difference in the Latin between the two is that the perfect passive infinitive has esse instead of sum, but they both take the perfect passive participle form, portatus. So we've now covered the perfect active and perfect passive indirect statements. But if you'd like to go back over the basics of indirect statements in more detail, tap the pop-out banner in the top right of your screen for my video on stage 35. Right then, let's move on and have a look at some new vocab. Complures, several. Dignus, worthy. Discere, to learn. Deus is a god. Dubitare, to doubt. Exercitus, army. Fieri, to become. Oblivisci, to forget. Odium is hatred. Patria means homeland. Paulo, a little. Perturbare, to disturb. Proilium is a battle. Putare, to think. Revocare, to recall. Securus, without a care. Tempestas is a storm. Trans means across. And finally validus means strong. So now, let's have a look at a few examples of perfect active indirect statements. Scio imperatorem victori multa primia promissae. I know that the emperor promised many rewards to the victor. Audimus milites multos captivos in Britannia cepisse. We hear that the soldiers have captured many prisoners in Britain. Caecilius dicit, se, servum ignavum punivisse. Caecilius says that he punished the lazy slave. And it's worth bearing in mind that in an indirect statement, any reference to the subject of the main verb is expressed using the word se, meaning he, she, it, or they. And this avoids any of the ambiguities that we might have in English. So in number 3, we know in the Latin that it was Caecilius who punished the slave, and not someone else who hasn't been mentioned, because if it was in that case, we would use the word eum. But this is a bit complex. Essentially, what it means is se is reflexive, so it just shows that Caecilius is the one doing the verb. I know that probably sounded very complex, so if that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry. Just to reiterate, se is just a reflexive pronoun. And now, let's have a look at a few examples of perfect passive indirect statements. Scio servos e domino liberatos esse. I know that the slaves have been freed by the master. Domitianus dicit nuntium ab agricola missum esse. Domitian says that a messenger has been sent by Agricola. Mercatores dicant templum novum in foro extructum esse. The merchants say that a new temple has been built in the forum. And notice that in each one of these sentences, the perfect passive infinitive has been translated into English with the words has been. Okay, so as usual, it's now the point in the video where I would like you to test your understanding. So pause the video and have a go at translating these. Now let's go through the answers. Dominus credit servum fugisse. The master believes that the slave has fled. Audio Romanos multa oppida deluisse. I hear that the Romans have destroyed many towns. Libertus dicit nuntium ab Agricola missum esse. The freedman says that a messenger has been sent by Agricola. And the first two sentences include a perfect active, and the last is a perfect passive indirect statement. So if you manage to achieve 3 out of 3, that is a perfect score. Well done. If you manage to achieve 2 sentences correct, that is still a really strong effort considering these were new topics. And if you only manage to achieve 1 sentence out of the 3, don't worry, that is still not a bad performance, especially as these were challenging. I know that you'll do better next time. Well done. So we've now covered stage 37 of the CLC. So let's summarise. Perfect active indirect statements are formed with a main verb, an accusative, and a perfect active infinitive, which is translated to mean to have something. And perfect passive indirect statements are formed quite similarly with a main verb, an accusative, but a perfect passive infinitive rather than a perfect active. And a perfect passive infinitive is translated literally to mean to have been something. And finally, all indirect statements are translated into English with the word that. So thanks for watching, and join me in my next video where I'll be covering stage 38 of the Cambridge Latin course.